Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. For our February episode of the podcast, you are joined by myself, Rachel Sherlock, and with me for this episode is Matthias Conroy. Welcome back to the podcast, Matthias.
I emerged from the tomb after my 5-year absence.
Yeah, we were looking back on when you were last on this podcast, and I genuinely was sort of horror-struck to find out that you haven't been on in 5 years, which it's almost a surprise to me that this podcast has been running for 5 years, let alone that I could have had friends on only 5 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was quote-unquote season 1, right, mm-hmm. that I was in twice. Yeah, I think it was both season 1, but yeah, no, it's been a minute.
It has been a while, and we have been talking about doing another episode ever since you were last on. Mm-hmm. So we've finally organized it. The last time you were on, I believe, was in some ways a slightly unusual or contentious episode. We were talking about the young Pope.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that today.
Which we didn't necessarily recommend with universal acclaim, but was worth thinking about. But you're back this time to talk about an album, which again is maybe a slightly left field topic for us, just because I think there will be plenty of people, in fact the vast majority of people will not have listened to this album, will be lucky if they've heard of this artist or at least realize that they've heard of this artist. But I was thinking, because this time last year in February I did an episode with Shane Jenkins, who is now your brother-in-law, on the album Offerings by Typhoon, which again is an album that I really, really love. So it feels like February is maybe my music month.
Yeah, I'll be back in a year or 5 years.
Yeah. Well, hopefully back in a year, because you and I have discussed doing an episode on the 1975, which I think would be a really great episode. And I think there's so much to talk about with them. Mm-hmm. And I think for a while we had planned that to be our next episode. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, I often call this, it's hard to be definitive with anything like music in your life, but I think this is my favorite album that we're going to be talking about today. And it was 10 years since it came out just last September. And the artist, the band, re-released it in a sort of stripped back, more kind of acoustic version as a sort of 10-year anniversary. And so for that and for a lot of reasons, I've been really deep diving back into this album in the last year. It meant a huge amount to me when it came out. It's meant a huge amount to me in the last year. And the album is Strange Desire by the band Bleachers. So Bleachers is the band name for a group that is headed by Jack Antonoff. And if you don't know about Bleachers, and if you don't feel like you've heard of Jack Antonoff before, there's a good chance that you actually have heard of Jack Antonoff, because he is probably the most prolific and famous producer of pop music at the moment. I think he's won Producer of the Year 3 times a row at the Grammys. So he's kind of the name in music producing at the moment.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think he even produced, I forget which one of the Kendrick diss tracks in the back and forth. It was like a hilarious subtle dig, because Drake was digging at Kendrick for working with Taylor Swift, and then Kendrick gets Taylor Swift's producer to produce his next track. But yeah, I mean, he's huge. He's on the soundtrack for Romeo plus Juliet on Broadway. I'm pretty sure he did the soundtrack for Despicable Me 3. He just got all his friends to cover random songs from the 80s, so he got St. Vincent to do a cover of Funky Town. And he's done various TV shows and stuff like that, so he's even aside from his work co-writing and producing, he's just kind of he's all over the place. He's across.
I know there was an Apple TV series that I think it was New Look, I think it was something about Chanel, they also did the soundtrack for. So he's across genres. He's in hip-hop, rap and things like that with Kendrick. People found that very surprising, but he's most known for his pop music, especially his Starlets. Although we've already referenced the 1975, he produced their most recent album, which is an incredible album. Famously, he's the producer that Taylor Swift has been working with for, is it close on also a decade now?
Yeah, maybe a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it was 2014 when they started working together. So. And also Lana Del Rey, Sabrina Carpenter most recently. A lot of those big names, the big female stars, have been working with him for a long time. But he was part of a series of bands himself He was part of the band Fun, which was very famous, but not a band that I was at all interested in. But then as a side shoot from that then became sort of his main personal project for creating music, he founded this band called Bleachers. And as I said, their first album came out 10 years ago. And I want to shout out my friend Darina. Darina has introduced me to a lot of great music, including Taylor Swift in the 1975. But she was the person who introduced me to this band. And like I said, this album in particular has been extremely formative. I've enjoyed every single one of their albums ever since. And they had an album come out last year, which was their self-titled album. It's strange that your fourth album is your self-titled album.
Yeah, it's a weird... Tom Petty did the same thing. Apparently that's like, I don't know, a thing where you just randomly make your fourth album the self-titled one. But, I don't know.
But yeah, their self-titled album that came out last year was amazing. They came out with a quote-unquote Christmas track called Merry Christmas, Please Don't Call this year, which I also listened to an obscene amount. Maybe even a worrying amount. But at the same time, I've loved all of their albums. But for me, Strange Desire, I think, stands out to me most as an album as like a complete piece. It's hard for me almost to talk about the individual tracks because in a really good way, to me, a lot of them kind of meld into each other. They flow from one to the other. They have echoes of each other throughout them.
Right. Yeah, no, I know this. It's kind of, I feel the same way with Two Door Cinema Club's first album, Tourist History, where it's like a fantastic album and the tracks, I don't really think of it in terms of tracks, not because they're like samey, but because they just, they form a cohesive whole to such a significant extent, where it's the other albums, they often, and I personally, I don't even know if Strange Desire is my favorite. I'd have to sit down and do a pros and cons list for all of them, but I certainly think that the other ones do intentional experimentation with genres, where the second album is kind of very city pop feeling in a lot of ways, but has like a country song. That's the second last track. And things like that. Whereas I think Strange Desire overall is a more cut from the same cloth. Yeah,
absolutely. And just to give like a tiny bit more background, maybe we should talk about, Matthias, you and I, and our history with this band.
Fun, because I was thinking about it, I remember the first time I'm pretty sure I ever consciously heard their name was talking to you at a U2000 retreat back in, I don't even know when, like 2019 maybe?
Yeah.
18, 19, something like that. And we were talking about Taylor Swift, as we were wont to do. It was soon after Reputation came out, and you were talking about who her support act was, and you were like, oh yeah, I was hoping that Bleachers were going to be her support. And I was like, who's Bleachers again? She was like, oh, it's Jack Antonoff's band. I was like, oh yeah. And then my sister Robin, I think independently, got into their second album, Gone Now, which was my introduction point. And it was kind of that classic thing where someone introduces you to something and then they end up getting more obsessed with it than you did. So I listened to that album a huge amount and then went back to Strange Desire, and then I've been following them in all their releases since. But yeah. So that was my introduction to Bleachers. But
yeah, and then so I don't think, and I'm not sure I would have been early enough on them. I was very early to them, but I don't think I would have been quite early enough to make any tour dates that they would have had for Strange Desire. But I don't think they had any European dates for that album anyway. Sure. I did then make it a big priority when they had 1 or 2 London dates for their second album, Gone Now, which I went to. And by the time their third album was coming out, both Matthias and I were big fans, so when they announced their tour dates, I, of course, immediately bought the two of us tickets to the London date, which then was very heartbreaking for me because it got postponed because the band got COVID, and so the date that it got moved to was the date of a friend's wedding, and I couldn't, well, it was actually the day after, but I wouldn't have been able to travel that far. And so I had to miss that particular concert, but Matthias made it and brought another friend of ours. But I sadly had to bow out of that one. So actually, it was coming up on this time last year for March for their latest album. They were doing another couple of European dates, specifically in England. And so finally, a year ago, Matthias and I, after so many years of trying, made it to a Bleachers concert together.
Yeah, it's funny because I've never actually traveled to see a band. There have been times I've considered it and kind of regretted it, but I've never actually pulled the trigger and traveled to see a band in concert before. And technically, I've gone to England 3 times to see Bleachers, even though I only actually saw them twice.
That's right, because they cancelled it so last minute that you came to London anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
yeah, that's hilarious. So yeah, it was such a great experience. They're amazing live. But yeah, I guess The reason why I want to talk about Strange Desire is not just to sit here on the podcast and say, this is an album that I love and you should listen to it, although that's a perfectly valid statement.
Indeed, that was actually the end of the first podcast we did together, the one that was just you and I, that my recommendation was the Bleachers MTV Unplugged concert album.
Really?
And I know at least one person, Ryan, actually followed up and listened to it as a result of that. You were specifically like, oh, let's do an episode on Bleachers. Maybe Strange Desire. Maybe that can be the link that we use. So fulfilling the prophecy, probably over 5 years later, we're actually finally here.
Yeah, that's amazing. But the reason why I'm tying it into a Risking Enchantment episode, at first may seem like a bit of a stretch. I've definitely done episodes that feel like a bit of a stretch. This one at first seems like a stretch. They are not a Christian band. I believe Jack Antonoff's background is Jewish. And he does use some Jewish imagery in like his promotional stuff, but he's said, even like I was listening to an episode with him, an interview with him very recently, and he said, I'm not religious. He does use some Christian imagery. He references Jesus a couple of times in some of his songs. And even there's like a couple of interesting themes in his later albums. There's a song on the third album, which is What Did I Do With All This Faith? And he explores some interesting elements of faith. But for the most part, like I would not at all say that any of these songs, especially from Strange Desire, are at all explicitly dealing with anything from a faith perspective. But they are dealing with things from a somewhat, I would say, a profound and like verging on spiritual perspective. In particular, that it deals with grief and the idea of what's left of someone after they die. Yeah. But also, the thing that I would say about Strange Desire is that even the name of it feels very evocative and almost spiritual. It's an album that talks about love, and we're going to dive into a little bit how it is one of the few albums that feels like it manages to talk about love in a romantic way, but also in a familial and in a platonic and in a lot of different ways, and often doesn't specify in what way it's talking about love, and treats love with the same kind of profundity no matter what element of love it's talking about. And when I listen to it, there's a lot of the ways that lyrically that Jack describes love that for me evoke the type of way that we talk about love when we talk about it in relation to God. And it's funny how it's not that any of these songs to me feel like they're directly talking to God, but they remind me of God.
Right.
And that is why I think it's a really interesting album to explore its themes, just because it takes love seriously in a way that I don't feel like a lot of pop music does, even when it's talking about it romantically. Like I think there's like an interesting way in which it's a very non-tactile album. Like it's not really describing the physicality of love in a lot of ways,
or even like particular events generally. Like sometimes it does like talk about being in a location, but it's like, is he literally talking about being in that location, or is it like an archetypal sense in which he's in that location? A lot of it feels very like, I don't know, disembodied in a meaningful way or something.
Yes, and I was saying to Matthias just before we started that like I feel like there's a type of vagueness that's really bad in pop music that like it always reminds me of Bo Burnham, the comedy musician, who he has a song which like is deliberately sending up pop music called Repeat Stuff, and it has a line which is like about your eyes with their bluish, brownish, greenish color, because you're being so non-specific so that it appeals to everyone.
The Win Butler of Arcade Fire, who actually will interestingly come up maybe once or twice, but he has this bit where he's talking about, he's again the same concept, but he's just like the lyrics where it's just like, everybody feels this way. It's like, yes, I do feel this way.
Yeah, and so there's a type of vagueness that's really bad in pop music, but this isn't vague as much as, like you said, disembodied in a very kind of profound way, where it's more like it's really grappling with what love is in a very, it feels almost like Jacob wrestling with the angel, that like it's actually trying to grapple with what this thing that is called love is, especially when you don't have a personified God to grapple with, you know? Right. So yeah, that's kind of the angle that we want to go in with this album. I think maybe the first thing that I want to talk about in terms of the album, which is relevant to all of Bleachers' music, which is just that they have a very particular sound, and it's one that I enjoy a lot, and I mean a lot, which is this evocative of the 80s, but not in a way that's very pastiche, that it is very much incorporating a lot of new elements and like pushing out the boat. There's even like parts of Strange Desire that are quite experimental. We've already referenced that there's kind of interweaving elements. One of the things that I really love that he does in this first album, and then again in the second album, it's less so in the following albums, although it's coming back a little bit now, but he takes samples of voice messages that he's received, or he has people come into the studio and just like have conversations with him and like take snippets of those conversations, and they get repeated and layered through the different songs so that they all have these recurrent themes. So in some ways, yeah, there is definitely a modern take of freshness to it, but lying at the base of it is this very nostalgic 80s sound. And I think I know actually your sister Robin, who we've already mentioned, was on this podcast talking. We did an episode on nostalgia from the 80s and Stranger Things, and we specifically talked about Bleachers in reference to this.
Right. Yeah, no, it's an interesting point, and I think as they've proceeded, and it's something which you talked about a little bit with the re-release of Strange Desire, which we'll talk about a little bit, and even the title change is significant, but that as time was going on, it's felt less like him just kind of doing a project by himself, which he curates, and it has more of like a live feel, where it kind of feels like all the band is in the studio together, just like doing a take and then recording it, and it feels much more like frenetic and live, which has its own appeal for sure, and there's definitely through lines which go through it, but I think especially this is really highlighted in like the heart of what the band was when he conceived of it. Because you said he's been a touring musician for like a lot of his life, and he went through Fawn, and then he had his own band Steel Train, which he didn't sing, and then he had Bleachers, which I feel like Bleachers is really when he got to like pour his heart and his vision into a project in a way that he hadn't been able to previously, because he was kind of in charge,
right?
And I think that led to, like, you definitely see in the lyrics of Steel Train especially, there is him touching on some of these themes, but I think something which is important to mention now is Jack lost his sister when he was, I think, 19?
18, I think.
18, yeah, and his younger sister?
Yes, yeah. She was 13.
Yeah, and then his older sister is still alive, but she died of brain cancer when he was a teenager, and that ties its way through his entire career of his music. Even when he's, in the most recent album, talking about other things, it's often in reference to moving on from this particular thing, which was kind of the central fact about his life for a lot of his life, and especially a lot of his life as Bleachers and as being someone who created this thing. So I guess the reason why I'm bringing all this up in the context of the sound is that I think the sound is actually very connected with the intention behind the band, and I think you touched on that idea of like hope and nostalgia. And he kind of sums it up really nicely. He has a bit in all of his gigs on the last tour where he talks through the origin of the sound of Bleachers, and it's different every night, but there's one recorded from when they performed in Radio City, and I would highly recommend going to listen to that live album. Their live albums are excellent. But he says, and I'm going to paraphrase, but the origin of the band lies in one sound that you've been hearing all night. It's that low sound that feels like it's hugging you. If you take it away, you've got so much anxiety flying through your air, all your thoughts, etc., and you put it back in and you're glued together. You feel that, and it's literally just a pad synth droning on a B flat. And he talks about times in his life when he was touring and he was just completely scattered and anxious and didn't know what he was doing with his life, and then he kind of felt this sound. It's really, I don't know, I think it's very profoundly spiritual, where he hears this sound, but he's not literally talking about the sound. He's talking about the indication of this sound, this hum, which was keeping him together in these moments. And then he actually heard the sound in an aural sense, and in this music that he was listening to, these albums he was really enjoying, and he tried to find it, and there was a specific keyboard, the Juno 9 keyboard, and he ordered it, and he got it to his apartment, and he plugged it in and started playing this sound, and he was like, okay, this is actually the sound I've been looking for. And that became the sort of cornerstone of of Bleachers, and the way he describes it is that I noticed this low humming sound that glued everything together, and I loved it because there was a lot of sadness in it. So it wasn't apologizing for any sadness, but there was also a bunch of sorry, I'm going to paraphrase because he swears a lot, and I don't want to swear on the podcast, but there's a bunch of hope pushing you forward, and I love this. And he talks about how that set off the process of finding band members and then finding an audience who for some reason wanted to celebrate grief with peppy tunes. And I think that it's that idea of not shying away from sadness or grief or the like awful things which your life sends at you, but also not wallowing in it and actually celebrating grief and the profundity of it and the meaning of it and the extent of it by pouring all your heart into this music that you're creating.
Yeah, I think that's so right. And because these voice notes that I was just referencing, I think it's telling that the whole album begins with this repeated sample of a voice note, which is, I think, his then girlfriend's sister saying, I really want to be grateful for all of these experiences. And that line goes throughout the whole album, which, like you said, is about grief and about a lot of pain. And yet there's this underlying repeated refrain of, I want to be grateful for all of these experiences. And I think that's exactly what he's conveying sonically, hourly with this sound. And like, it's hard, it's so hard to talk about music, especially when like I'm not an expert and it's hard to have the correct terminology. And even if I do, that doesn't mean the people listening have the same kind of language to talk about it. But yeah, that low hum that grounds you. And I love when there's a lot of videos of him explaining his production technique, and he talks about music in this way where it's like, this is the sound, like this is the low hum of like the hope that's kind of keeping you moving forward, and then up here is the frenetic sound that like is your anxiety, and here's the twinkly hopeful sound. And in some ways he's very literal about the way that he produces music and the way that he conceives of music. There was an interview I was listening to him recently where he was saying this, that like, I'm very straightforward. If you're whispering love lyrics to someone, it shouldn't be like stacks and stacks of vocals, but if it's the voice of God, then maybe it should have this like big sound to it. But one of the things that I really resonate with the way that he conveys feeling is that this 80s sound, which like I have a lovely quote from him here where he says, to me, the 80s were epic and sincere. Music was large and grand and unapologetic. And to me, what is being summed up there is this idea that there's an earnestness to the bigness of music with that kind of 80s sound, which is that I think once we moved in, it's, transitioning from into the 90s and then onwards, where we get to this idea that in order to be sincere, you have to strip everything back. And like the real sound of someone being sincere with music is just you and a guitar, and that's it, and there's nothing else. And like that can be true and really beautiful. But I think that there's also something really true in saying that your feelings to yourself feel big and cinematic and confusing and have lots of different elements and come back and forth and feel cinematic to you. Like your life does feel meaningful to you. Yeah. And so sometimes, and for me often, it's the songs that take those feelings and make them feel big that actually feel the most sincere and the most true to the experience of feeling them.
Right, for sure. And I think there's a very revealing quote I remember really stuck with me, where he says that he wanted Bleachers to be the midpoint between Arcade Fire and Disclosure. And I think that for people who aren't familiar, I listen to one of Disclosure's albums quite a bit, and then Arcade Fire are like my second favorite band. But I think the point he's trying to make is that Disclosure are a very like electronic synth heavy band. They often have just kind of repeated phrases being the entire song, or they have featured vocalists. It's not really, from my understanding and from my experience with them, it's not something which is really delving into like the sincerity of human experience. And Arcade Fire are on the far side, where they're really dealing with a lot of very human concepts and often very vulnerably. But both of them have this. Arcade Fire is a more sort of prog rock, symphonic rock sound, and Disclosure is more sort of synth pop. But the idea of Bleachers being kind of the midpoint between these, where it's like, well, we're actually discussing these really human things and these really big questions and these spiritual, metaphysical questions, but that doesn't need to be in opposition to this other sound, which actually means a lot to me. And it's actually, was part of actually what glued me together through these really big, deep human experiences. So I think it's something which really appeals to me because it's almost sanctifying or giving great significance to styles of music which people often dismiss as frivolous.
Yeah, I think that's really key, that like through this sort of big synthy pop sound, which again, like we were kind of saying, that some people feel like is insincere or maybe processed or something like that, that he's actually using it to talk about these feelings that are often in some ways characterized as feeling very small, like this idea of hope, like this flickering hope in the midst of something that might be very mundane. And I think even like that mundanity is important. And like this is maybe one of the last things we'll say about the sound, and then we'll move on to the album and the lyrics in particular. But he importantly describes all of his music, and then obviously beginning with this album, as being like feeling like an outsider. And he always characterizes this through the fact that he's from New Jersey, and he talks about the experience of New Jersey where you're literally this much smaller, run to your younger brother looking straight across at New York City. You know, that you can see it in the distance, you can almost hear it in the distance, that like the New York is where everything's happening, and you're essentially in the suburbs of New York. And he talks about this suburban imagination, and he says that anything that's classic New Jersey, there's a huge sense of hope, there's like a cinematic feeling, it's larger than life, you have to dream of these things. And then in another interview he says, city music is from the perspective of having anything you want to do and still not caring. It's wonderful, I love listening to it, but it's not me. If you're in the suburbs, you're forced to dream. If you live in New York City, you're not dreaming, you're there. So there's this like sense in his music that is both coming from, like we were saying, these themes of like loss of innocence with his like childhood and his teenage years and grief about that, but also hope for the future, that I feel like even sonically, like I just think of those opening strains of, it opens with a track called Wild Heart, and every time the album starts, it almost makes me tear up, because that's exactly how I feel. In fact, I think I was just saying to you that like you were over here a couple of days ago when we were talking about this, and I was like, oh, maybe this wasn't the best way to experience the album. But actually now on reflection, I think it is. When I started listening to this album, I was working in an office in a business estate, and I was between living at home with my parents and then moving up to Dublin myself. So at one time I was commuting from my parents, and at another time I was actually commuting out of the city to go to this job that was in this like business estate in the middle of nowhere. And it was a very strange place where it was just these very depressing corporate buildings on a big industrial estate that had some little pockets of quite nice, like they'd put a lake in somewhere or a little like stream and a bench somewhere, but it was a very strange setup, and there was no shops, and you couldn't really walk anywhere. And like, this was Ireland, it's not an American experience, not everyone had cars. Like I would get a tram out to it and then just be stuck in this office on my lunch breaks, and I didn't really fit in there. It wasn't really where I was sort of meant to be, but it was my first job out of college, and I would wander around this business estate listening to this album on repeat. But in a way it feels really fitting, because like it was suburban in a different way. It was like corporate suburbia. And here I was like dreaming of something bigger and better than this. And the album was exactly that, and maybe that's why it spoke to me so much at that stage.
Yeah, I think I don't want to jump the gun, but we'll probably return to this later. But the idea of like wanting to get better, because this is a song called "I Want to Get Better." If you, for listeners who aren't familiar with Bleachers, you may have even heard this song at some point. It's probably one of their
most famous.
Yeah, probably one of their bigger songs, certainly from this album. But he has this line about how wanting to get better is way better than being better, and way more realistic and much more romantic. The happiest I've ever been is when I want to move forward. And Rachel found that quote, so I'm stealing it from her. But I think that especially with this album, and even when he's married now, and he's written a lot of very touching love songs about kind of finally feeling like he's actually finally found his place and he's not wandering as much anymore. But I think certainly in this space, the music of Bleachers is very much a grasping kind of music. It's not like, here we are, these are the good times, leave your cares behind at all. It's looking at the hopeful horizon, and it's reaching towards it. So I think listening to it in a business park or your lunch break, it's actually kind of perfect. That it really embodies that sense of wonderful but not yet, or wonderful but over there, or something like that.
Yeah, and I think to move on to like kind of the text of the album itself, I just want to say that I just think he's such a genius at coming up with very small key phrases that feel very striking and inspire thought. And just to give some examples from later albums, like I just think that, you know, even I mentioned their Christmas track, Merry Christmas, Please Don't Call. A lot of them have this like almost declamatory or commanding sentiment to them. There's, off the second album, there's a track called Don't Take the Money, which again he talks about in this kind of suburban imagination thing where, you know, you move to the big city and you cash in for all of this money, and it's this question of like, maybe don't sell out, don't take the money, like go the alternative route. Or he's got some other ones like Stop Making This Hurt. But what I often think in terms of Bleachers is a track that he has, which is called How Dare You Want More. And I think that that's so important. Even like that comes, I think that's the third album, but all the way back to Strange Desire, it's like this desire for more. And I think even just to begin with the name of the album, like it just feels so evocative and spiritual to me that like it reminds me, it feels quite Augustinian to me, that like, I think I referenced in the last episode that I've been thinking a lot about St. Augustine, and there was a couple of quotes of his that really struck me in relation to this in terms of how dare you want more. Like there's that quote he has which says, enlarge your desires. Do not bear the yoke with unbelievers. The deeper our faith, the stronger our hope, the greater our desire, the larger will be our capacity to receive that gift, which is very great indeed. No eye has seen it, it has no colour, no ear has heard it, it has no sound, it has not entered man's heart must enter into it. And then also even in terms of that sense of strange desire, and even like the basis of the sound of the whole album being about hope and yearning, it reminds me of that St. Augustine quote, which is, the desire is thy prayers, and if thy desire is without ceasing, thy prayer will also be without ceasing. The continuance of your longing is the continuance of your prayer. And like, again, obviously, as we've mentioned, this isn't coming from a Christian perspective, but I think that sense of continual desire, not in, like, as we've said, there's a track called Don't Take the Money. He doesn't talk about this desire in a, you know, when I get all the money and when I get all this success. It's more, when will I be free to love the way that I want to love, and when I want to get better, as you've already referenced, that like it really doesn't come across as like a material yearning, but much more an emotional and a spiritual yearning. And you referenced that like they talk about the announcement for this sort of re-released album, he changed the name, and so he accompanied the re-release with this statement, and he said, on this anniversary that feels so sacred, which is an interesting choice of words there. On this anniversary that feels so sacred, I have realized something. It wasn't only a strange desire to write these songs. There was something unknown to me happening. I was looking for you, my people. It was more than a strange desire to make this album. It was a stranger desired. And that's what they changed the album name to. And I just think there is something about that like mysterious person being longed for. And it's my podcast and my rules, so of course I have to reference T.S. Eliot. But it reminds me of In the Wasteland, where it's kind of a riff off two things. It's actually a riff off like the Diaries of Shackleton, when they're in the snow and they keep kind of counting the people around them and miscounting them. And then also referencing the road to Emmaus. Where he says, who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. And I love that sense of like, you keep catching a glimpse of them out of the corner of your eye and keeping like, is there more of us here than we, like, I keep counting us, but there always seems to be another person. Yeah. And that feeling of like, an unknown person that's being desired. Yes,
yeah, I think there's St. Hildegard and C.S. Lewis. There's another St. Hildegard thing I'll touch on later, but she has this idea when she's speaking about music that there's an inherently, music is order, where it's bringing order out of chaos, and it's bringing beauty out of chaos. And when we hear music, we get like a little taste of paradise, of God's beauty and God's order. But it's melancholic because it's only a taste, right? It's only a flavor. Lewis talks about this a lot in, I think, both Surprised by Joy and Mere Christianity, I want to say. But that idea of reaching for something which is, you want it to be there with you, and you want to like be totally immersed in it, but it's fleeting and it's transitory. And I think that's what Jack is often aiming at is this idea of being kind of free from all the freneticness and actually just being in this space where you can, like he says in one of the songs, I won't let up until the wind is gone. That it's the idea of being buffeted around by the vicissitudes of daily life and searching for this space. And as he said, and it ties back to what the original quote where he's talking about looking for these people. And he says, when I come to a Bleachers show and I play these songs, I'm up here, I don't feel anything else because I'm celebrating a certain kind of grief. I think you guys are here for the same reason, so let's do that. That it's these people who he's found who feel the same way, and also the fact that those people exist and that he was looking for those people is part of the feeling as well. There's a lot, I don't know.
That's fantastic. That Hildegard quote really reminds me of a Tolkien quote, which was that we all long for Eden and we are constantly glimpsing it. Our whole nature at its best and least corrupted, its gentlest and most human, is still soaked with that sense of exile, which I had pulled out. And it's funny because it's only just struck me how it reminds me of it now, but I had pulled out because of his music being so filled with this sense of loss of innocence and mourning that, at the same time as, like we said, this sense of yearning and hope for more and the beyond. Yeah. And it reminds me of, and we're going to talk about it's probably the last track we'll talk about, but there's a track that's very central to the album called You're Still a Mystery, which again, like you could almost imagine a praise and worship song being called but it was one of the tracks that was written last. I think it might have been the last track written for the album, but it has the name of the album in the song. It's the only one that has the specific name of the album, but it says, I was feeling like I never was young, followed a dream and a strange desire. That like feeling like maybe all of your life had been corrupted, that like maybe there wasn't this time that was pure and is innocent and free, but you're still following this dream and this strange desire for like what we're talking about, this sense of fulfillment and connection with people. And like I just think that that's so unusual and profound for a pop album. And I always think another one of their lyrics that almost, I would say, haunted me for a long time is the very opening of their second album, Gone Now, which actually carries on a couple of the samples from the previous album. So it's like it's bridged between the two. So you can almost see these opening tracks as a continuation of the previous album. But the first very like explicitly stated lyrics after these kind of samples of the album is all the hope I had when I was young, I hope I wasn't wrong. And that line in particular just is so heartbreaking to me, that like, you know, at one time you had all of this hope and now you're at a stage where you're just hoping that you weren't misguided in having all of this hope. And then it goes on. It's funny, he uses a line that combines two track names from the album. He says, I miss those days, so I sing a Don't Take the Money song. But yeah, so like I miss those days when I had hope, you know. And I think even the third album that he said, he summed it up by saying the theme of it was unearned hope, which I mean, I think all hope is kind of unearned in some ways. Sure. like if your hope is at all based on practicality, it's a very limited kind of hope. But yeah, I just think that it's such a great starting off point, is just the title of this album being Strange Desire. But I think, yeah, if we want to move into how the album depicts love in its lyrics, maybe we can. Yeah,
sure. I just wanted to say that the I think that his idea of being kind of stuck, he has this really interesting dichotomy which he explores both in the first two albums, of being kind of stuck between never growing up from the position where he was in denial before his sister died. And there's a really good documentary called Thank You and Sorry, which we watched a few days ago, where he talks about like the fact that his sister was dying didn't really hit him until she actually died. And
yeah, she'd been sick for so long, right, but that it didn't kind of touch him. He didn't think of it as like a bad thing until she died.
Right. But I think that there's that spirit of almost kind of like denial and kind of like where it's like part of you is this part which has been destroyed by grief or has been like racked and sort of ransacked by grief. And there's part of you which is the innocent part, which isn't even considering that. And they're both like, he has this like, I was 16 in a van driving myself to Florida. Part of me never left that seat. That it's the idea of there was this hope when I was young, and it reminds me of when St. Paul says hope against hope, which I always think is a very mysterious and interesting phrase that you could sort of sit with a lot. But it's like, all the hope I had when I was young, I hope I wasn't wrong. Where it's like, he can't give up on hope even when he's questioning whether the hope he had when he was young is wrong. And it's that kind of journey, and it's a big journey in psychotherapy, is trying to knit together the different parts of yourself that have been fractured through traumatic events. And I think he talks about in a podcast where he's talking with the lead singer and the kind of creator of the Mountain Goats about the only way he could process this grief was through writing and through music, that everything else was just avoiding this, and this was his only outlet. So I think that it leads nicely into the idea of how he describes love in this album, because this was kind of the only way he could do it. I really, really love that. So I think we've done a lot of talking already, but maybe to get into the nitty-gritty of some of the tracks of the album, it's probably worth starting at the start. As Julie Andrews tells us, it's a very good place to start. One of my all-time favorite tracks, again, and especially as an opening track, I just can't explain to you how much it does instill me with that feeling of like hope and sorrow. But this track, Wild Heart, it has so many elements to it. I think I was like plotting out how he portrays love in order to like talk about it for this episode, and I felt like I had to just keep coming back to Wild Heart, like he does this in Wild Heart again, and he does this in Wild Heart. So it's a very good opening track in that it kind of contains within itself a lot of the elements that then get explored more kind of singularly in other tracks. Right. But to start with one of the elements, I love how he portrays in this track that like that sense of pursuit, that like that loving calls you to pursue that love, that like it's not just a passive thing. Because in I think it's a pre-chorus, but it says, well, everything has changed and now it's only you that matters. I will find any way to your wild heart. And I love that sense of, and we're going to come to the word reckless, but like that reckless abandon of saying that like, this could cost me anything. Like I will find any way into the mystery. Again, mystery is a word. Every word that I use feels like it's going to be coming up in later tracks. But that there's a mystery to that heart that needs to be actively pursued. Yes. Yeah, no, I think that's bang on. And I think it's a really interesting thing on this album, and kind of throughout his writings in general, is this, we kind of touched on it earlier with the idea of this like disembodied specificity or something, where it's not always clear whether he's talking about his sister or a lover or someone else, or like I know he says he's not religious, but he does actually reference God quite a bit and his relationship with God, and certainly he seems to think that, or at least at one point believed that heaven was a place that people go when they die. So it's kind of, he's one of these people who it's not central to his. So it's always hard to unpack what exactly his own personal beliefs are.
Yeah.
But it's not always clear who the second person in the song is, right? Who the actual object of the song is. And I think that's almost beautiful about it, where you can keep coming back to it and keep reflecting on it in different ways. And while it's really important, I think it's an interpretive key to know about the fact that his sister died, and so much of it is learning to process that. It's not like this is the one thing that he's talking about. He's talking about these themes which touch on that and which are brought about by that and which are processing that. But they touch on things which are much bigger and more formal and more archetypal. And I think that's in the writing process. It's not even just that he's taking these singular experiences and writing about them in like a generic way in any way. He's actually writing about a lot of things at the same time.
Yeah, that it can be multi-layered. Yeah. And I think even just, again, that phrase wild heart, I think to me speaks about a conception of love that isn't overly domesticated, and like it doesn't sort of lie down for your approval. that it's not, it does respond to you, but not necessarily in ways that you expect or can control. And it reminds me of that, like, you know, the description of Aslan, like he's not a tame lion. It's a wild heart that you're talking about. And I think this is even more pointed in a track called Reckless Love. This is where the word reckless comes in. And I think it's an interesting track because, I mean, again, a lot of this is experiential, because it's funny when you sit down to talk about an album and you pull out the lyrics and you're like, oh, that's exactly the lyrics. Like, you don't necessarily always experience songs with the like specificity of each word that you hear. But, I think on paper, if you're looking at this song, I'm not 100% sure it would represent a positive romantic dynamic. I almost think that it represents a much more true dynamic, or like a less broken dynamic, when it's placed in the context of looking towards God, because there's a demanding nature to it. And like love in our world and in romantic relationships is demanding, but I think there's more of a sense of like God has the ultimate demanding authority on our lives. And so it is right to lay down your life entirely for him. Whereas, you know, I think if you were in a relationship romantically where one person was doing all the demanding and the other person was doing all the capitulating, we might be like concerned about that. And again, like we've said, it's not that you get the specificity of what the dynamic of this relationship is, but just to point that like, it's not necessarily that I would say that this represents a specifically positive dynamic in every context. But I do think that it has a profound representation of the demanding nature of love that is almost frightening. So I think it opens with like, if you're really breaking it down, I think it opens with a question of like having an argument, because he says like, I keep finding my way to the harshest words. I got a strange vision of your reckless love. And he goes on to say, so give me a chance to remember what I've given up to defend you. I would burn my dreams away just to stand in the thankless shadows of your reckless love. Which, yeah, there's just an all-consuming burning quality. And then as the song goes on, there's, I guess, a bridge at the end that is like, it's almost kind of shocking in that he's sort of shouting out the words, get out, stand back. If you don't let go, you're going to break me. But then it ends with, I would stand in the thankless shadows of your reckless love. And to me, it's almost like an Old Testament rendering of God. I think I'll be talking a little bit in my things I'm enjoying at the moment about like the scripture reading that I've been doing at the moment, but it reminds me of that part, that section in Exodus with Moses, where God, I think it, like, if I'm remembering it correctly, that Moses has been communicating with God in some fashion face to face, and then he makes this plea for Israel and to reconcile God to Israel, and after that God doesn't meet with him face to face. And there's this, I have the biblical quote here, which says, I will show mercy to anyone to whom I want to show mercy, but you cannot see my face because no one can see me and live. There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. And when my glory passes that place, I will put you in a large fissure in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. Like there is almost this, like, the glory of God, the love of God has the capacity to break us, that like, you know, when he's shouting out those words, like, you're going to break me with this reckless love. And we're going to come to the song Shadow, but like stand in the shadow of that love. Again, it feels very biblical, and especially kind of Old Testament biblical imagery. Yeah, I think that's right. I don't even think I have much to add on that. I think I think he meditates a lot on. Interestingly, he almost never uses the word peace. I can't think of any time where he talks about the word peace, but I feel like a lot of it is dealing with peace and the absence of peace, and what it's worth sacrificing when it's worth sacrificing peace for the sake of something else, and what it's worth sacrificing to get to peace. But I think that idea of, sometimes actually you have to, love is not safe and it's not tame, and you actually to engage with it in a real way, in a real incarnate lived way. It's not always going to be like a lowercase p peaceful. It's not always going to be safe, and it's going to be frenetic and dangerous sometimes. And that it calls you out into, like Abraham, pick up your life and go somewhere unknown. What is the experience of peace in that, you know? I totally agree. So that, like, those two elements are something that I really love, but at the same time, as much as we're talking about how love can be demanding, it also doesn't see brokenness as something that precludes or is an obstacle to love. And I think, as I've said, we can move on to the song Shadow. I think it's interesting. The album, like I said, has a lot of these interweaving tracks. And then there's some of the tracks that are singles. They are literally singles, and they feel like singles because they're more easily plucked out of the album. And Shadow is one of them. But at the same time, I think it does such a great job with this kind of more profound imagery in what is a pop single, you know, that like everyone could listen to. which, yeah, when you showed us the documentary, Thank You and Sorry, he talks about having written this song about reading an article, and the article was saying that your shadow is all of the horrible parts of yourself. And so he writes this song where the chorus is, if you're feeling small, I'll love your shadow. And also then it has a bridge at the end, which again is very moving and like quite, again, for a pop song, just a surprising element where it says, and I know that they have hurt you, and I know the love you gave feels cheap and used, and I know it's getting harder, and I know the lights have all gone dark on you, still I will love your shadow.
I think the line even before the refrain, if you're feeling small, he says, how love dies is a place that I'm not going. And it's this idea of, I'm trying to think of what there's... is it Hell's Moving Castle? I'm trying to... Anyway, there's that idea of kind of seeing something which is fiery and out of control and kind of wading into the maelstrom and just bringing love into that space, which is, as we were talking about, like frenetic and chaotic, and just saying, hey, all this stuff is terrible, not shying away from that. As you said, like the sound, it doesn't deny sadness, it acknowledges sadness, but it introduces hope. And I think that the idea of love and hope, I think, are very intertwined, both in theological virtues and also in the writings of Bleachers. But I think that it's this idea of encountering something which is really difficult and really not easy to like box away or not easy to minimize, and saying, hey, I'm acknowledging this and I'm still willing to fight for this.
Yeah, and I love the way that it hints at the way that brokenness plays into both the ways that we love and receive love. That like in this, it's maybe more how you receive love, which is like he is, as a singer, is speaking to someone who feels broken in some ways, that like, yeah, I know that they have hurt you, and I know the love you gave feels cheap and used. That like, again, like that we need God to show us how to be loved. And then in turn, we, in our own broken way, have to try and rise to the challenge of loving back in a better way than before.
Right.
And I think maybe that's where we come back to Wild Heart, where again, he just talks about this sense of feeling like at some point in his life he's gone astray. And again, that like, yeah, that the response of love is in some ways a demand for change from yourself. That like it's tied in with this sense of pursuit that we've already talked about in Wild Heart, that like not only do you have to pursue it, but in order to pursue it, you have to have some kind of moral courage, and that there's something that is that there's a call to virtue there. So in the lyrics it says, from the years I was changed by crooked hearts. And then it goes on to say, why did they have to go and do us like that? Why did they have to go and run from the dream far away? Again, the idea of like, those people have had the dream and they've turned their back on it. They took the money and that they've become crooked hearts, which have now broken me in some way. And then he says, were we there? And then I don't know, like, it's just, in some ways it's a throwaway line lyrically, but maybe sonically it stands out because it's just before it goes into the pre-chorus. But it's just this line that stands on its own for me, where he says, were we there? Was I brave? And like that question of, that like you were called to something better, and did you fail in bravery at the time? Like, I just think it's so poignant, that question, like, was I brave? Was I brave enough in love? Yeah.
And I think it's that the kind of the upshot of that song, Don't Take the Money, which we've been talking about, is that idea of selling out, where it's like you take the easy option. And it doesn't even, he's explicitly said, it's not literally about taking money always. It can just be about like going for the easy, safe option, instead of actually encountering the difficulty of real love and real life. And it's interesting that phrase "dream far away" is actually sampled in the second track in Good Morning on Gone Now. You hear the same line from the first album is sampled in the second album, which I think is kind of reiterating that point of like grasping and looking. And if you give up on the dream far away, if you take the money and you accept an easier, simpler, neater, less meaningful life, you trade something real and meaningful and beautiful for something that's easier. And I think that a very clear normative sort of proposition in these albums is that's the wrong thing to do, is that you should not take what's easy and safe if it's not right and good.
Absolutely. I love that so much. And I think that maybe brings us, we've referenced it already, but I think that brings us to the most kind of the track that was most proliferated from this album, and still to this day is probably one of their most famous tracks, which is I Want to Get Better. And as you've said, that like, you know, he had this quote about it, which was that like he was exploring how the desire to get better is better than feeling like you've achieved being better. And again, that goes to this, I think that's so fitting with a kind of spiritual perspective, which is that like we know we don't reach perfection in this world. And so the desire to be better, and there's that word again, desire, this like, and the St. Augustine quote of like ceaseless desire, the prayer to improve is better than feeling like you've necessarily arrived somewhere, because it is an ongoing quest to know and love the heart of God.
Yeah, it reminds me of that Newman quote that in a higher world it is otherwise, but here below to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. That we never really arrive as, we may catch glimpses of it, we may have those moments where you're performing Bleachers songs on stage and you're just in that moment and you're hearing that sound and you're not thinking about anything else. But in this life, in this lower world, as Newman would say, it's transitory, and it's not, and you have to keep changing. We're never settled in this world. We're pilgrims. And
I think what's especially beautiful about the way that Jack talks about the desire for change is that the impetus for change is personal. And a personal encounter. So the chorus of the song says, I didn't know I was lonely till I saw your face. I want to get better. I didn't know I was broken till I wanted to change. I want to get better. So at first there's this sense of like, I didn't know that I needed something until I had this personal encounter. I saw your face and I realized that there was something lacking and something broken within me. And so having seen your face, I want to get better. And then upon wanting to get better, you realize the difficulty of getting better. And, I feel like that's every spiritual treatise ever, which is that like, as soon as you want to change, that's when you realize how difficult it is to change. And that's also when you realize how much is in need of changing. I was listening to one of the Father Mike videos from Ascension Presents. It was probably, I've been cycling through a bunch of them, so it could be pretty old at this stage. But he was talking about, I think he's actually, here's the connecting webs of all of the sort of Catholic notable names, but I think he was actually referencing a talk by Bishop Barron where he used this image, but that like when you're driving away from the sun, your windshield can look fine, and you can see everything through it and everything's fine. And then you turn around and you're facing into the sun, and suddenly all of the grime is very visible on it. And it's not that grime wasn't there when you were facing away from the sun. It's just that you didn't have the means to recognize it by. He was talking about it in the sense of like, do you suffer more when you follow Christ? And he was saying that like in some ways it's not necessarily that you like suffer more, but you have the mechanism, which is the love of God, to see the imperfections that need amending in your life. And then that, demands action of you. So again, like it comes back to this thing, I didn't know I was broken till I wanted to change. And how much from a Christian perspective we see that like that change is essentially impossible until you start relying on God's grace in order to help you through it. I think it's really important diagnosis of that, like the process of change, where it's like you have to the encounter awakes the desire, and then the desire elicits a response, a choice, and that's the choice, that's the point of choice, where you can say, okay, I'm going to take the easy save option and live a less meaningful life, or I'm going to go and do what's hard. But I think it's really key to include desire in the stage where you have to be woken out of your dogmatic slumber to actually seek that change in the first place. And that, as he says, it comes from a personal encounter. So I think that idea of like personal encounter to desire to choice to change or not change, as the case may be, to take the money, is I think is a very apt diagnosis of like the process of motivation in human action. And I think it's very fitting that in the context of this particular song, that desire for change is a personal encounter, but it's actually a personal encounter from beyond in some ways, because he talks about it in reference to it being elicited from dreams of his sister. Like at the end of the song it says, woke up this morning early before my family from this dream where she was trying to show me how a life can move from the darkness. She said to get better. I just think that that's so it's so beautiful, because it is, while it's not necessarily about God, it is about the feeling of someone from beyond calling you, that says like it is possible to get better, not only in the sense of like, you know, things get better, but that you can move from the darkness. It is possible to step from that space. And maybe, as we've been discussing, that grief does follow you, and like you are changed and you are impacted by the brokenness of it, but that there's still some kind of requirement to get better.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think if we're talking about grief, as much as like I Want to Get Better is the sort of standout dance anthem track, and that is very much like, you know, when we talk, you've already referenced the quote about like celebrating grief through peppy songs. Like, you know, it is someone in a very dancey, poppy, jaunty way shouting out the words, I want to get better, 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 I want to get better. You know, there is like, is it a happy or is it a sad song? And the answer is it's both. Like, in a very Catholic way, it's both at the same time.
And I think it really delves into this, because it sounds almost, the line after that where he says she said to get better, it sounds like, it sounds suicidal, where he says, I put a bullet where I should have put a helmet and I crashed my car because I want to get carried away. But when you hear him talking about that line, it's the idea of, earlier on he says, put a helmet on a helmet, where he's like, he's
buffering himself.
Yeah, exactly. He's like surrounding himself in bubble wrap to avoid actually facing reality. And he's running away. And that leads very nicely into the bit you've taken out from Like a River Runs here.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think the other song on the album that like is maybe the most specifically about grief is this other song, Like a River Runs, which has this great drum beat, this great like rolling sound to it, and again is less maybe peppy than I Want to Get Better, but has this sense of movement to it, but is very much about grief. And some of the lyrics from it include, when I fall asleep, I can see your face. What I lost in you, I will not replace. And I could run away, I could let them down, but I will remember your light. Your light, it follows me in darkness. I'm trying hard, but I can't win. And I've played the victim for a long, long time. And I want to grow up. From the rhythm of a younger heart, it leads just like a river runs. And then he goes on to say, that night I sent over the parkway. The summer's gone and I'm alone, and I get the feeling that you're somewhere close, and I want to get up to the rhythm of your wild heart. It beats, been beating since you've gone, which again, like I love how it calls back to Wild Heart in that lyric. And then you've already referenced these lyrics, but it ends with, if you see me in the darkness, I hope you know I'm not alone. I carry you with every breath I take, and I won't let up until the wind is gone.
It's really it's meditating on that. It makes me think of Hello My Old Heart by the Oh Hellos, which is another band we love, which honestly definitely do probably multiple episodes on them as well. But it's drawing from a passage of Lewis again, as they're very inspired by him, but that idea that if you lock your heart away, if you just kind of cushion yourself behind these like helmets and these shields and this armor, that you are in a sense safe, but you're letting people down. I could run away, I could let them down, and that he is actually letting down his shield and he's being vulnerable and accepting this is what happened, and actually embracing the legacy of his sister and not running away from the fact that happened, and he's actually carrying her with her and being strong, accepting the tumult and the difficulty and the grief of that, but saying, it's worth carrying this through. And from that position, I can progress to a stage where the wind is actually gone, where I'm not just hiding away. I'm actually in a state of legitimate peace. Yeah.
And that, like, I almost read that line, until the wind is gone, of it, like his own death, when the wind from his own lungs is gone.
Sure.
That I won't let up talking about how you're still here and still meaningful, and that there's still love there. That like I can keep that up throughout my life, that it doesn't have to be something that I move on from, but that like I want to grow up, that like, as you've been saying, that sort of stuckness, that status from his past, that he wants to move on from, and yet carry her with him. That like moving on with your life doesn't mean moving on from her. And that it can, again, this question of like both at once. You want to grow up, you want to leave this behind, and yet you want to carry it with you.
Yeah, and he talks about that when he's talking about the process of writing this, and he's saying that it's on like the same podcast with the Mountain Goats, but it's like he's saying that maybe this is kind of what I'm going to write about forever. That I'm a little bit more at peace with that this is just a story which I revisit, but I revisit it from all these different angles. And he says like, if I carry this stuff with me, as I change it, or as I carry it, it changes, and then I see it from different perspectives. And you see that throughout the course of his albums, where he's returning to this theme of loss, but he's doing it in new perspectives, and different experiences are changing that. And he says, so you may still be writing about the same thing and notice that its character is different, so you get very different angles depending on the other experiences you have. And I think that's it can be helpful for understanding that it's not about, process, move on, done and dusted, neat. It's a very, I feel like the unneatness of life is something which they very much dwell on.
Yeah.
Things don't have neat solutions, at least real and good things don't have neat solutions.
Yeah.
But that actually, you can actually continue to live while accepting the messiness and the things which are bad and horrible and ugly and dark.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you have to freeze up or escape or,
Yeah, that like, the question of love and death and mortality can't be neatly boxed up.
Right.
And that like on some levels, it is a scandal that should preoccupy your life.
Yeah.
Like from a Christian perspective, there is a scandal of death.
Yeah.
That we should be horrified by it. And like you come back to Jesus weeping at the death of Lazarus, that even from that divine perspective, death is still a scandal.
Yeah.
And that profound love can't be just sort of boxed away.
Yeah.
Especially when it has such a tragic ending. And it's like, it's the book of Job, like this big question of the problem of pain.
Yeah.
There isn't a big answer at the end of it. There isn't the bit where, God comes down and says a lot of things, but he doesn't say, this is why you're in pain,
Yeah.
That like both that death, especially when we're talking about it in the context of this album, that death is something to be wrestled with, but it also is the thing that gives things meaning.
Yes. Yeah.
And again, to come back to Wild Heart, as I keep doing, it has a line that says, to think that everything must die for anyone to matter, got to find any way to your wild heart. And since we're back at Wild Heart, and we can talk a little bit more about that question I kind of raised at the very start with this pursuit of love, there's this like question of the heart and like the pursuing of it. And I think, again, a lot of what happens in this album is a really profound exploration of the mystery of someone's heart. And we're going to come to that word mystery, but just before we get to it, I want to call out some of my favorite lyrics, which is in a track called Wake Me, which starts with, right from the start I knew you'd set a fire in me, and I'd rather be sad with you than anywhere away from you, and hey, I can't believe I captured your heart. There's just that sense of like, I can't believe that this has happened to me, that I've been able to enter into this.
Right.
And that like, again, there's that undomesticated nature of love. I've captured your heart in some way, that like this wild heart that's like roaming free, and in some way that I have a place and a hold over it.
Yes, yeah.
But as much as I love that lyric, it's quite a short song, that Wake Me. Although I love, again, there's a bridge at the end with a repeated line, if you're lonely, 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 wake me.
Yeah.
And I just think that that's just such a beautiful encapsulation of love, But we've referenced it a couple of times already. The last song that I want to talk about, and as I've said, it was the last song written for the album, and I love the way that he describes it in that documentary, Thank You and Sorry, where he says that like he was looking at the parameters of the album and the way that the track sat within it, and he felt like there was something missing at the center of it. And the track doesn't sit at the center of the album, it's towards the end, but it does feel like a central sort of thesis of a lot of what's going on in the album, and it's called You're Still a Mystery. And when he's talking about it, he says that the song is about like the mystery of somebody else's heart. And he says that that's what's exciting about being in love. It's not you're meant for me. That's all rubbish. I'm skipping over the expletives. But that's all rubbish. What's exciting is looking at someone after the time period of love chemicals, after you're looking at them and you're thinking, oh, wow, you're still a mystery. Not because I'm high from being in love. That's what being in love is, just the giant weird mystery that you want to be a part of.
Yeah, I think that's something which I was thinking about a minute ago, is that these lyrics, this discussion is necessarily somewhat exploratory and meditative because there's no one definitive answer to this, where I'm thinking of like, I love Taylor Swift, but I'm thinking of like the bridge of Back to December, where it's like, I love your tan skin, your sweet smile. So like, it's like, it's really specific details. And it's like, yeah, it's a very heartfelt, sincere tribute to a lost lover. But these lyrics, because they capture something which is much more archetypal and it's not tied down to any particular instance, you can read them multiple ways, and you can also keep returning to them in different contexts and see them from different perspectives. And I think they were also written from, in a sense, by combining different perspectives and different experiences into one cohesive whole.
Right.
And that, I think, is such a wonderful encapsulation of mystery, which is something which goes beyond reason, which is something which you can't neatly box away, as we've been saying throughout the course of the podcast. It's not something which you can neatly categorize. Mystery is something which you have to keep returning to, and you can come and get a better grasp of it over time, but it's not something you'll ever have a full handle on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so right. And I think something that can be interesting about Taylor Swift is the way that she can be so specific, and yet it can feel relevant to so many people, which is a kind of interesting dynamic in and of itself, that like almost in drilling down into the specificity of her experience, that like in being so specific, you reach a point of archetype. But I think, again, what these lyrics are doing, which is something kind of just so kind of spirit shocking to me, which is that like, that it can be archetypal and have that feel specific. It's almost the inverse.
Right.
And so just to read out some of the lyrics from this song, You're Still a Mystery, we've referenced some of them again, but I want to read the two lines again because they lead into another lyric, which is, again, very important to this discussion. So, I was feeling like I never was young, followed a dream and a strange desire. You picked me up in the dead of the night and gave me a chance to move on inside of your mystery. I mean, there's so much there about like mourning for youth, following the desire. You picked me up when I was in the worst part of my life, and you gave me a chance to move on while inside of your mystery.
It's not a fleeing where you're staying outside. It's you're moving on, but you're moving on inside. It's not running away, letting them down. It's actually accepting it, but then you don't stop there either. You don't stop outside and you don't stop inside. It's a constant journey. It's like C.S. Lewis says in A Grief Observed that he's like, I found out that grief isn't a state, it's a process, where there's no, in this thing, it's not static, it's a constantly moving thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then the chorus is, maybe I don't need to understand why your love is such a mystery, which again is just a great line that like, I don't need to understand, but I'm going to keep exploring that, because there's always more to explore. Yeah. And then the second verse, again, this question that we've been talking about like eliciting a better response from yourself, where it says, want to give you something better than I've been, want to write your name up on my wall, wake you up in the dead of the night, breaking the lines, just trying to get better. Then it goes on to say, man, I was feeling like I never was young, know nothing simple about the simple days I mourn. If what I lost ain't ever coming back, then I can find a way to move on inside of your mystery. And then it has these like repeated lines. And I think it's interesting. I'm not trying to recommend using the Lord's name in vain in terms of expletives, but it's actually interesting that he actually references God here, and he's not talking about God, but he's saying, it says no God, but it almost feels more like, oh God. Like, I don't necessarily think it's a denial of God. I think it's more just that, like, he's using it in this, like, declamatory way where he says, no God, holding on tightly, your love, holy inside of me. That, like, that idea of like the love is something that is sacred, is holy, within you. And then he goes on to say, and again, like, there's lots of allusions within these lines, but he says, someday I'm gonna make this right. Someday when the lights are low, someday I'm gonna get on my knees. Someday I'm gonna beg for your mystery. And again, like, that's the idea of like get on your knees, like there's kind of marriage allusions, but that like that I'm going to make this right and I'm going to beg to be part of this mystery.
Yeah.
And then again, it goes into maybe I don't need to understand why your love is such a mystery. Yeah. It just feels like such a brilliant and deeply moving encapsulation of the themes that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I think that idea of like there's an idea of he has this kind of faith in something bigger than the world. Like the song What Do I Do With All This Faith, which is a closing track on his third album, he's using faith as an analogy. The way I understand it, at least, is he's using faith as an analogy for the kind of the spirit of music, which he is hoping to, which he feels like is kind of dying a little bit, and he's trying to kind of, he's holding on to this. But I think that in a more conventional understanding of what faith is, that in the song Everybody Lost Somebody, which very much touches on a lot of these themes, again in the second album, it's like wait till the night was over, curse the sun for coming up below her. So again, dealing with the thing of his sister's death, and the refrain is I know that I'm lost in a world without you. But interestingly, there's that line in the song where he says, I've got a debt I've got to settle with heaven. And it almost feels like there's this unresolved tension of kind of believing in God, but not quite knowing what to make of that, or thinking that there's some eternal debt, or there's something which I haven't resolved, which I'm kind of sitting with, which is sitting with me because of this experience that I've had. And the podcast, which I keep referring back to, he talks about this song called, I think it's the number one song in heaven by Sparks, and about how this really helped him process his grief, because it's this silly song that's like it's meant to be like written by God and be the number one song that's currently in heaven, and it's like if you fall asleep and wake up here or don't wake up, then you'll hear this song. But he was saying the idea of imagining heaven being a place which is actually kind of full of levity and full of that it's not something which is entirely serious and grim, actually really helped him process this grief. But I think it's something which he touches on repeatedly throughout his lyrics, is this tension which has been introduced by this profound grief and this profound metaphysical grief, if you like, the idea of someone leaving you, but trying to hold on to them, and the kind of different ways that can have significance, both in them still being there in some sense, but then also cherishing the memory of them and honoring that. But yeah, so that's when I heard, and again, within all these things, there's multiple ways to interpret them. But the idea of like someday I'm going to get on my knees, it's like someday I'm actually going to deal with this and acknowledge it.
Absolutely, yeah. That like I'm going to get on my knees, I'm going to pray, I'm going to figure this out, I'm going to get this right.
Right.
Yeah, that there is a sense of it being like, yeah, just that, like you said, grappling with that debt with God, and the way that I just like how it actually balances those two types of love. That like, I think from a Catholic perspective, we have some of this language with, like, I think it's in Isaiah where it talks about your maker, your builder wants to wed you, that there is a romantic element to it. And so the question of like, your love is such a mystery in a romantic setting is very true and good and right. And I have a quote here from Fulton Sheen, who says, in a true marriage, there is an ever-deepening mystery and therefore an ever-enchanting romance.
Right.
And I love that. Like, it really plays off of what his quote about, like, oh, when you're still here after all of the love chemicals wear off, and you're like, it's still such a mystery, that the mystery goes on and the enchantment and the romance go on as you go deeper. It's that, we've been talking about C.S. Lewis, but further up and further in. It's such a beautiful way to think about it. And, but then it also completely rightly and justly can be a language for how we describe how we relate to God. Even in this romantic way. That I have this quote from Henry Nouwen where it says, and again, like using this word mystery, it's so easily tied to this album, but it says, the unfathomable mystery of God is that God is a lover who wants to be loved. The one who created us is waiting for our response to the love that gave us our being. God not only says, you are my beloved, God also asks, do you love me? And offers us countless chances to say yes. That is the spiritual life, the chance to say yes to our inner truth. The spiritual life, thus understood, radically changes everything.
Yeah. And I think I think sometimes it can seem like, from a certain perspective, if you're talking about songs which aren't about God and you're reframing them to be about God, sometimes I think there's an instinct, one which I've almost never shared, but I can understand, where it's like, oh, you're just reaching. But the fact is that the scriptures constantly use analogies of different kinds of relationships within a family, between spouses most often, to refer to the relationship that we have with God. And I think that while the topic of God himself is only intermittently brought up in Bleachers, there are so many, I think, just correct meditations on love and on what that is and what relationship is. And I think that there's a quote from St. Hildegard which I pulled out, which is prophets, and I think prophets can kind of sort of be understood as what's like fortune tellers nowadays, but that's really not what it is. It's about somebody who speaks truth in a decisive way, which calls us out and calls us to change. Prophets have the task of creating music for persons because our souls are symphonic. Music reminds us of paradise. It directs our desire towards this source. And I think that holds true even when you're not explicitly talking about, you know, God in the second person, right? Where you're saying like you, or even describing God as an entity, though he does sometimes. But you're describing things which do direct our desires, or strange desires, if you like, towards the fundamental truths of which God represents and which God has created. So I really don't think that it's reaching at all. I think that if you look for wisdom in this area, it gives you wisdom which also applies to God and to our relationship with God. Absolutely.
I think that like maybe the straw man negative characteristic of it is when maybe sometimes I think less so in I don't know, maybe it's maybe within pockets of Catholic culture, which is like maybe uncomfortable with certain portrayals of love in pop music and says, well, what if it was just about God instead, and that would make it fine, you know? And that's a kind of co-opting or like an almost like a hostile takeover of the song. But I also don't think that that's all that common within our culture. I think you're right that like this is not about seeing something that isn't there or wishing that it was about something that it's not about. It's just recognizing that even outside of an explicitly Christian context, you know, obviously people have encounters with love, and in having an encounter with love, they are necessarily having an encounter with God as we understand it. And so there are really true lenses that we can take this through. And I think, as you've said, our point overall is just that in being so earnest and in being so truthful in his grappling with love, that in his lyrics, Jack Antonoff has managed to convey something true about love, and ergo is something true about God, and even not like a fullness of truth in any way, but something that can be meditated on and delved into. And like I said, to come back to the very start, where my sort of thesis statement, which is just that I can think a lot of albums are really good and can think a lot of albums say something true about romantic love here on earth. But this was one with, like, without trying, often made me think about God.
Right. And I think it's, everyone has encounters with love, but I think you can describe them well or poorly, right? Where it's if you there's lots of people who describe love, what's that song? It's like being in love means never being lonely again, or something like. There's just people get stuff wrong, plain and simple. They just like describe love badly, or they describe things as love which just patently aren't love. And I think the thesis we're kind of advancing with this is that Jack Antonoff, probably through his experiences, many of which are very difficult, has earned an understanding of love which I think in many ways is very on the money, and in some ways maybe even extends beyond his intentions for the profundity of it, where I think he's a very wise person. I think that he really understands a lot of the dynamics of love, and hearing him talk about his relationship with his wife, Margaret Qualley, especially on the most recent album, and him talking about it is really, I find, really profound and moving and personally inspiring in my relationships with other people. And it's kind of that hard-earned wisdom which comes from experience, which you might not be able to get just simply from sort of isolated meditation alone. It's that interesting thing between mystery and reason, right? Where it's like we often, as Catholics, focus on the fact that there's mysteries which are beyond the gamut of reason. But there's things which are beyond the gamut of mystery, right? Where you actually kind of have to live them in order to... and you have to use and apply your reason in order to get to the stage where you can contemplate those mysteries or to deal with things which aren't mysterious. So there's this really interesting interplay between experience, meditation, contemplation, and I think that in his life he has synthesized those things to create some really beautiful products which have really profound truths in them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of quotes, both I found some secular sources but also religious sources, which is that, like, and again this question of, you know, in that last song he's talking about mystery, and mystery is something you contemplate, that like in all of these things, the mystery of life and creation and God, that mystery evokes a desire to understand. And when it is to understand a mystery, again, it is not the case that we're going to get to the bottom of that,
right.
but that there's a vast sea of understanding that can come between like the point at which there's a gulf where we just have to take that last little bit on faith.
Yes, exactly. And I think if you rely too much on, if you don't actually come to that gulf, you can actually end up going really wrong. If you just like abandon it to mystery too quickly,
right?
And to kind of, it's almost like an ivory tower version of life where it can all just be, you could just sit in a room, be a disembodied entity, and you can understand all the truths of life. But I don't think that's the faith that we believe in. We believe in a faith that involves lived experience and involves, and then that brings you up to that point where you have to take the leap of faith, or where you have to delve into the realm of pure meditation and contemplation, where reason has reached its zenith and can go no further. But it's important to actually get to that stage first.
Yeah, and that in a lot of ways we can say the beginning of that contemplation is desire.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it just comes back to this strange desire, this stranger desired.
Yes.
All of these. Very, like I said, I just think he does a great job of having these phrases and these singular kind of epitaphs that call, at least me as a listener, call me into contemplation.
Yes, absolutely.
So yeah, I think maybe that's the summation of our deep dive on strange desire. There's been a couple of episodes on Risking Enchantment where I really feel like I don't know whether anyone has spent as much time thinking about something in terms of a textual criticism as much as I have on this particular topic. But I'm so grateful to get the opportunity to talk about some of the things that mean the most to me. And so thank you, Matthias, for joining me on this journey all those years ago when you got into the band to now actually like sitting down and saying, okay, well, what do we want to say about this album? And like, why does it mean something to me?
Yeah.
So thank you very much for joining me on this, and thank you to the listeners for bearing with.
I might actually close with a quote which I wanted to throw in somewhere, but I feel like it actually sums up a lot of things that we've been talking about and I'll maybe unpack it a tiny bit, but it also maybe leans forward because it's a quote from Matty Healy of the 1975, which hopefully we'll talk about at some point in the future.
Yeah, maybe sooner or later.
Yeah, exactly. So in the same way that the previous podcast closed with Bleachers, I'm going to hope to close this one with this in terms of kind of like leaning forward, but also it's talking about a song he wrote called Guys, which he described as like a love song to his friends and to his oldest friends. And he says, songs are very pointed at relationships and how formative those experiences are. But there's not many songs about non-romantic relationships, and these can be the most formative experiences. I wanted to write a love song for my friends. I've had the same best friend since I was 13. The fact I haven't written numerous songs about that is probably more ponderous, one would think. But yeah, I feel like it sums up the ideas we were talking about in Strange Desire of the multiple ways in which love can form, and that it's not all about fleeting romance, and that often the most formative relationships in our lives are more than that. And also, I've known Rachel since I was 10, so since before, even 3 years before I was 13. And I feel like the fact that there's like the 5-year gap between then and now, I feel like sums up a lot of things very nicely. So watch this space for us talking more about the 1975. But
yeah, oh man, I'm getting teary-eyed thinking it's the journeys that you and I have gone on in our lives. It's funny to think of how long we have been friends, and the proportion of our lives that we've been friends for.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and I think it's the thing that like friendships can be really formative and lasting, and I think it's really important. And I feel like it's true in a meta way that we're discussing this, but it's also true of our lives. So
yeah. Oh, thank you. So thank you so much, and thank you to our listeners for joining us on this exploration. I really hope that some people will take this and go and listen to the album, both Strange Desire and Stranger Desired, but I would definitely start with the first version of the album. And yeah,
and get into Terrible Thrills Volume 2.
yeah.
There's actually 3 versions of the album. Yeah,
he released a version of the album which is all covers by female artists.
Yeah, because I think he says he imagines his songs first being sung by a woman, and then he has to like translate them into his own voice. Which actually explains also why he so often works with women as well.
I think so.
But yeah, there's 3 lots of those songs.
But to close us out, well, first of all, I have to ask you, which I think I forgot to remind you, do you have something that you're enjoying at the moment?
Yeah, I can. I was thinking about that when you mentioned it halfway through. In a moment of panic, I was like, I didn't actually think of anything. And I'm going to cheat a little bit because this is kind of, it's touching on, because most of what I've been doing with my free time recently has been playing music. So I'm going to shout out a channel which really helped, YouTube channel which really helped me with my journey. He's a guy called David Bennett. He's an English, he used to be, I think, played bass guitar, but he's settled on keyboards. But he does really accessible videos about music theory, which use examples from contemporary music to illustrate them. It's really engaging. It's as with music theory, you kind of just need to like dive in, and slowly it starts making sense as things start coming together. But I found him really, really helpful. And I've been really enjoying playing and learning music theory, and he's been a really big help to me. So if you have any interest in music or music theory or just song structure, songwriting, anything like that, and using examples of songs that we've talked about, I think, in the podcast today, then David Bennett Piano is a great channel.
Yeah, and as you were talking there, I wanted to shout out, I've referenced a couple of times on this podcast that I've gotten back into playing music and playing music live and with friends. And so I just want to shout out Matthias, who has been the driving force behind this for me. And he organizes open mics, and I just love getting the opportunity to play at those, and specifically with you, Matthias. It's a real joy. And I know you've taken to putting some of those up on YouTube. So there may come a time where I will actually even link to a video of us playing together, which would be really, really fun.
We have done at least one Bleachers song, right?
I think so.
One. We did
Self-Respect.
Yeah, we did Self-Respect. I think it's only one though so far.
Yeah, I really wanted to do their Christmas song, but then we didn't have an open mic over Christmas, so I'm not sure I could do Merry Christmas Please Don't Call in February. It might be a bit out of place, but I was thinking of another song of theirs which I really love and is very profound. So another shout out. This is from their most recent album. It's called Issimo, and the lyrics on that are really very moving for me as well. So, but yeah, I don't know. Like I said, we may at some point share. You'll get another little glimpse into my life. For another glimpse into my life, things that I'm enjoying at the moment. I referenced in the last podcast that I was going through the Word on Fire Bibles, which have all of this great commentary, and part of that has like kind of led me down to re-exploring kind of scriptural studies and like diving into studying the Bible. Again, this really pays tribute to how long Matthias and I have been friends, because there's another group of fellowship activities that we've been involved with, which is that I used to hold a Bible study in my apartment, and then it became a kind of fellowship group rather than specifically a Bible study, and I jokingly called it, in inverted commas, a Catholic Bible study. And my joke was that because we're Catholic, we don't study the Bible.
It was actually, the Young Pope podcast was a fruit of Bible study, because one of the things we quote unquote studied was watching and critiquing the Young Popes.
I'd forgotten about that. Yeah. So but it's just been, I think you go through phases, but it's been something that's been very rich for me at the moment. And so I'm currently about halfway through Scott Hahn's book, A Father Who Keeps His Promises, which is a look at the covenant structure of the Old Testament and then its fulfillment in the New Testament. And I'm really, really loving that. And so, those are the things we're enjoying at the moment. I want to say a big thank you to everyone who's subscribed to my Substack. I want to especially thank those who have opted for the paid subscription. I am really incredibly grateful. But I just want to say thank you to everyone who has subscribed in general. And if you haven't, please do. And the newsletter for the podcast will contain all of the links, and I'll definitely spotlight some of the live performances of Bleachers that you've mentioned, and maybe some of my favorite tracks. So I'll put some extra content in the podcast newsletter on Substack. And as always, as I've said, I'll do a monthly list of recommendations as well for February, naturally. So we'll see what else gets in there. I might do it music themed. There is I won't spoil it, since, like I said, I have to have something for the paid subscribers. But Matthias will know what I'm talking about when I say, if I suggest that maybe the movie I will suggest is a music documentary that is one of our all-time favorites. Yeah. So, other than that, if you're not following us on Substack, you can follow me on Twitter and on Instagram. And you can find more about the podcast on rachelsherlock.com. And other than that, I just want to say God bless and thanks for listening. Goodbye. This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.